Well, to summarize, there is a standard view of democracy. It's the view of Justice Powell. The public should assert, or the view that he expressed at least, the view that the public ought to assert meaningful control over the political process. And there's a contrary view. The contrary view is that the public's a dangerous enemy, and it has to be controlled for its own good, of course, the way you control children, like you don't let a 3-year-old run across the street. The first view is the rhetorical view. The second view is the view that's actually held, and you can see that it's actually held when a crisis of democracy erupts and the unwashed masses begin to try to enter into the political arena and have to be somehow repressed, either by force, as in the Red Scare, or by other means in order to overcome the crisis of democracy. Well, with regard to the media play a big role in this, and with regard to the media, too, there is a standard view. The standard view, for example, is expressed again by Justice Powell in the same discussion when he claims that it's the crucial role of the media to affect the societal purpose of the First Amendment, that is, to allow the public to assert control of the political process. Standard view was also expressed by Judge Gerfine in an important decision, the Pentagon Papers decision, when he permitted the New York Times to publish the Pentagon Papers. And he said, we have a cantankerous press, an obstinate press, a ubiquitous press, and it must be suffered by those in authority in order to preserve the even greater values of freedom of expression and the right of the people to know. That's one view. That's the standard view. And given that view, we then have a debate. The debate is over whether the media have gone too far in their defiance of authority and their adversarial stance. The right wing claims they've gone too far. They're overcome by a liberal bias. We've got to do something about it. The liberals, as in the Trilateral Commission, all in fact agree. In the same study, they say that the media threaten government authority by their adversarial stance, and they've got to be curbed. If they can't curb themselves, the government is going to have to move in to curb them. The executive director of Freedom House, Leonard Sussman, asked whether free institutions must free institutions be overthrown by the very freedom they sustain. Rhetorical question, meaning we got to do something about this excess freedom that the press is using to attack the government. He was writing about a Freedom House study of the coverage of the Tet Offensive, which became a sort of a classic, allegedly showing that the press lost the war in Vietnam by unfair criticism of the government during the Tet Offensive. It's an interesting, if there's no time to talk about it, I may try to get back to it. If not, maybe get to it in discussion. Very interesting study. It was total fraud. Falsified the data, you know, the whole thing was faked. When you actually correct the errors, it turns out that the real charge of Freedom House was that the press, although completely supportive of the government policy and working completely within the framework of government propaganda, nevertheless was too pessimistic, they said. They didn't tell you by what standards it was too pessimistic. The obvious standard is to compare it with, say, internal U.S. intelligence assessments, which we have thanks to the Pentagon Papers, and it turns out the press was more optimistic than U.S. intelligence because they were believing the public statements and they didn't know about the private statements. So Freedom House's complaint reduces to the fact that the press, though totally supportive of the propaganda, didn't do it in an upbeat enough fashion. I wouldn't have surprised George Orwell that that should be the criticism of the press produced by an organization called Freedom House. But that's become the standard since. Everyone refers to that as the study that proves that the press was too adversarial. Well, that's the debate. Then the defenders of the press say, no, we're not too adversarial. Maybe we are too adversarial, but you got to tolerate us even though we're cantankerous and so on. That's essentially the issue. Well, outside of that debate between those who say the press is too adversarial and must be curbed and those who say, well, yes, the press is cantankerous and impossible, but we just have to suffer that in the interest of freedom, outside the spectrum of that debate, which constitutes virtually the entire mainstream discussion, virtually the entire discussion, but outside the debate, there is another position. The other position challenges the factual assumption that's taken for granted in the debate. According to this alternative view, the media do indeed fulfill a societal purpose, but a very different one. Their societal purpose is to inculcate and defend the economic and social and political agenda of the privileged groups that dominate the domestic society. And they do this in all sorts of ways. They do it by selection of topics, by distribution of concern, by the way they frame issues, by filtering of information, by emphasis and tone, by simple fabrication sometimes, but crucially by the bounding of debate to make sure that it doesn't go outside of certain limits. The bounding both in the news columns and in the opinion columns, because of course the news columns themselves embody all sorts of assumptions and ideological presuppositions and so on. According to this alternative view, to the extent that there is a liberal bias, it serves primarily to bound thinkable thought, that is, to instill the unchallengeable assumptions, which in fact reflect this rather narrow elite consensus. So the liberal bias performs a real function. It says, thus far and no further. I'm as far as you can go, and I go as far, how far I go is still accepting the basic presuppositions as unchallengeable. Now, within those bounds, there's ample controversy, and it reflects the tactical divisions among elites over how to achieve generally shared aims, but these limits are very rarely transcended. So the media thus function in accordance with what my co-author Edward Herman and I have called a propaganda model in a recent book. That's another view. Well, the propaganda model has a lot of predictions. It has a lot of predictions about how the press is going to behave, but it also has a further prediction. The further prediction is that no matter how well confirmed the propaganda model is, it cannot be taken seriously, and therefore must be effectively excluded from mainstream discussion. And that actually follows from the model itself. The reason is that the model, if you think it through, the model rejects certain principles that are serviceable to power. That is, it falls outside the spectrum defined by the presupposition that the media are adversarial and cantankerous, perhaps excessively so. Now, that presupposition is a useful one. It's serviceable to the interests of established institutions to believe that what you're reading is actually criticism if it's in fact support. That's a technique, it's a sophisticated technique of indoctrination. And of course it's very serviceable to the media themselves. It's nice to think that you're, pride yourself on being an independent and courageous adversary of power. And since those assumptions are serviceable, they're going to be upheld according to the propaganda model, and no serious challenge will be permitted. So that prediction indeed is very readily confirmed. The propaganda model is never taken seriously. It can't be considered. Notice that the propaganda model has a rather disconcerting feature to it. Plainly, as a matter of logic, it's either valid or invalid. If it's invalid, you can dismiss it. If it's valid, you must dismiss it because it's saying the wrong thing. So one way or another, it's got to be dismissed by its very nature. Notice that truth is no defense. It's very much like the traditional doctrine of seditious libel, the doctrine that it's libelous, it's a crime to criticize state authorities because that undermines power. It's a doctrine that runs up to pretty modern times. And truth was never a defense against seditious libel. In fact, truth simply heightened the enormity of the crime of calling authority into disrepute. And the same is true here. Well, of course, the basic questions are factual. Are the standard assumptions correct? That is it true that the press is independent, cantankerous, adversarial, maybe excessively so? Or are the assumptions of the propaganda model correct? That's a factual question, and that's the main topic, but I'm barely going to be able to get into it. But before, though I won't try to really, no hope in a few minutes of providing real evidence one way or another, let me just talk a little bit about the way you would deal with this problem. It's a methodological question.